The clock showed 8:42 a.m. as Kendrick Robinson pulled into the parking lot outside the Greenville, South Carolina Municipal Courthouse. The warm sunlight of the morning stretched shadows across the pavement, and Kendrick let out a long breath. He disliked being late. As a federal prosecutor, his career thrived on precision and preparation. But today, circumstances had disrupted that structure. The morning was meant to be simple. He was only there to dispute a property tax error related to the home his late grandmother had left him. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes, and Kendrick had spent weeks collecting evidence to prove the change was unjustified. That house wasn't just real estate. It was the heart of his childhood, the place where he learned life's values under his grandmother's careful guidance. Wearing a tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt, Kendrick looked every inch the experienced attorney, even if his day had started off messy. A sudden call about a human trafficking investigation had delayed him. The defense had submitted a last-minute motion that needed his attention. He had reviewed it, advised his team, and dashed off to court, fully aware that he was cutting it close. As he climbed the courthouse steps, his phone vibrated. A message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office popped up. Judge in Greenville is known for being strict about punctuality. Watch yourself. Kendrick exhaled and slid the phone into his briefcase. He wasn't rattled. He had facts, and he came prepared. Still, the warning stuck in his mind as he walked into the chilly interior of the building. Municipal court was a far cry from the federal courts he was used to. The beige walls were drab, the seating worn and scratched from decades of use, and the air carried a faint scent of stale paper and old coffee. Despite its tired look, the place buzzed with motion, people whispering, clutching folders, nerves clearly visible on their faces. He glanced at his watch again, 8:50 a.m., 10 minutes to spare. Barely enough to find the correct room. He followed the signs down a narrow hall, passing murmuring groups and focused individuals. He stopped at room 204. A brass plaque read Judge Charles Whitman. Kendrick straightened his tie and entered. The courtroom was already filling up. Kendrick took a seat in the back, opened his folder, and reviewed his evidence. As he read through his notes, he looked up to see the judge enter. Judge Charles Whitman, tall with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, commanded silence with his presence alone. His no-nonsense reputation was apparent in how his gaze swept the room, missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff called. Everyone stood. Kendrick did too, his stance poised and upright as the judge took his seat. Cases began. One by one, Whitman moved through them with cold efficiency. His tone clipped, his expression unreadable. Kendrick noticed a man in a suit quietly and elate. No reaction. Minutes later, a young woman in jeans slipped in and sat down. Again, nothing from the bench. Kendrick observed, but focused on his case. At 9:15 a.m., his name echoed through the room. He collected his folder and approached the bench calmly. As Kendrick walked up, Judge Whitman looked directly at him, his expression suddenly steely. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," he barked. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than this court's?" Kendrick raised a hand, palms open in acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was dealing with a federal matter of urgency." The judge cut him off. "Excuses don't erase lateness. This court runs on structure and respect. If that's a problem, reconsider your priorities." Dozens of eyes bored into Kendrick, but he held firm. "Your Honor, I fully respect the importance of timeliness. If I may proceed, I'm here to present my case regarding a property tax error." The judge dismissed his explanation with a wave. "We'll get there. But first, contempt of court. A $750 fine for your tardiness." The words landed like a punch. Kendrick's jaw tensed, but his face stayed composed. Murmurs stirred in the gallery. "Your Honor," Kendrick said calmly. "May I explain?" Whitman raised the gavel. "You may not. Consider this a reminder to respect this court." Kendrick stepped back, thoughts racing. This wasn't just about being late. It was something deeper, something far too familiar. He glanced at the other late arrivals. None had been penalized. The difference was stark, and Kendrick wasn't going to ignore it. Sitting back down, he opened his folder, but instead of tax records, he began taking notes. His pen moved quickly. Meanwhile, the judge carried on with the docket, unfazed. Kendrick sat quietly, thoughts swirling. The courtroom drummed on in its rhythm, but he couldn't unsee what had just unfolded. He revisited the moment Judge Whitman fined him, then compared it to the silence met with others who had slipped in even later. The young woman now sat near the front, scrolling on her phone. A man in a blazer was mid-testimony, despite having arrived after the session began. Only Kendrick had been punished. It wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern Kendrick had long since learned to recognize. A $750 fine for municipal tardiness was unheard of, almost vindictive. He scanned the room again. The people looked confused, even uncomfortable, but nobody said a word. "Next case," Whitman called. Kendrick's name was said again. He rose steadily and returned to the podium. The judge locked eyes with him once more, almost challenging him. Kendrick began, voice even and confident. "Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the disputed tax increase on my grandmother's home. This property has been in our family for generations, and the new figures don't match historical assessments." He opened the folder and pointed to a specific document. "This page shows the consistent valuation for 5 years. The new adjustment marks a 30% hike, issued without proper notice or justification." Judge Whitman leaned back, uninterested. "I'll examine it when time allows, Mr. Robinson, but your late arrival this morning remains a serious concern. Are you suggesting that your federal responsibilities give you license to disrespect this court?" Kendrick's demeanor didn't change. "Your Honor, I intended no disrespect. I was delayed due to a pressing matter, a human trafficking case. I believe we can all agree that such issues warrant immediate attention." The judge's gaze sharpened slightly, though his voice remained steady. "Your intentions, however commendable, don't permit you to disregard protocol. Court procedures are in place for a reason." It wasn't just the judge's words that struck Kendrick. It was the subtle dismissal behind them. The unspoken message was clear. His reasoning wasn't valid. His career accomplishments, his integrity, even his effort to honor the process, none of it seemed to matter in that courtroom. Kendrick inhaled slowly, letting the silence fill the space. "Your Honor, I respect the necessity of following procedure," he said evenly. "However, I must ask, are these rules enforced consistently for everyone here?" A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. The judge's posture stiffened, a flush rising in his face. "Are you challenging the impartiality of this court, Mr. Robinson?" "I'm simply seeking clarification," Kendrick responded, his tone calm and controlled. "It's crucial to confirm that justice is applied evenly, not just to me, but to all present." The judge's gavel struck the bench hard. "I won't permit baseless accusations against this court. The fine stands." Kendrick nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "Understood, Your Honor." He walked back to his seat, aware of the stares following him. Some held quiet admiration, others caution. This wasn't Kendrick's first encounter with bias disguised as authority, but something about this moment felt different. The atmosphere had shifted. It was almost electric, as if the entire room was waiting for what might come next. Without drawing attention, Kendrick retrieved his phone and began typing notes swiftly. He wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. A quiet resolution had already begun to form in his mind. This situation wouldn't end in silence. The hearing carried on, but the energy had changed. Others noticed too. An older black man too rose ahead, glanced back, and gave Kendrick a subtle, knowing nod. The court clerk, usually robotic in motion, now typed with noticeable hesitations. She was uneasy, and it showed. When the session wrapped up, Kendrick lingered, watching the people exit with the quiet burden of what had just unfolded. A young law student in the corner was scribbling furiously, her face lit with a mix of awe and resolve. Outside, the cold air hit him, but didn't lift the tension. The everyday buzz of courthouse routine hummed around him, but Kendrick's thoughts had shifted. A plan was already taking form. He paused on the steps, phone in hand, thumb hovering over his assistant's contact. "No," he whispered. "Not yet." Instead, he stepped aside, flipping through his notes once more. Everything he had seen and experienced in that courtroom made one thing clear. This wasn't just an oversight. It was systemic. His instincts as a federal prosecutor kicked in. This wasn't just about a tax error anymore. This was the beginning of something much larger. Back in his car, Kendrick opened his briefcase and removed his credentials. The golden seal of the U.S. Department of Justice gleamed under the sunlight. It was time to take action. When he re-entered the courtroom, most of the cases had already been handled. The space was quieter now, with only a few people remaining. Judge Whitman was at the bench, sifting through papers. He looked up as Kendrick approached the podium again, badge and identification in hand. "Mr. Robinson," the judge said, clearly annoyed. "Court is adjourned. If you have additional concerns, schedule an appointment." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Kendrick began, his voice composed but firm, "I believe it's important that I properly introduce myself." He held up his badge so everyone could see. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've served for the Department of Justice for over 10 years, specializing in human trafficking, public corruption, and civil rights enforcement." The judge froze, his hands still in mid-motion. His expression shifted as Kendrick's words registered. The few people still in the room leaned in, watching closely. "I was late today due to urgent developments in a federal case. But what concerns me isn't just a fine. It's a clear difference in how others who arrived late were treated. What I saw raises concerns of inconsistent and potentially biased practices." The judge pressed his lips together, clearly uneasy. "Mr. Robinson, if you believe there was a procedural misstep, you're free to submit a formal complaint." "I've already started," Kendrick replied, raising his notebook. "Not just documenting my experience, but noting the unequal treatment of other late arrivals, particularly where race may have played a role. As an officer of the court, I'm duty-bound to report any indication of bias or discrimination." Judge Whitman leaned back slowly in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. "Are you suggesting misconduct by this court?" he asked. "I'm simply describing what I observed," Kendrick responded. "My commitment is to uphold justice fairly and equally for all. What I saw this morning demands further examination." A heavy silence settled over the room. The clerk fidgeted. The young law student in the back had stopped writing, just watching now, wide-eyed. The judge cleared his throat. "This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was a lapse in judgment, I encourage you to pursue proper channels." Kendrick placed his credentials on the podium. "I intend to, but I also believe this is a chance to reflect on how we uphold fairness and equality in every courtroom." The judge's fingers gripped the arms of his chair. His usually unshakable demeanor now faltered. "You may leave, Mr. Robinson," he said, quieter this time. Kendrick picked up his credentials and turned. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said over his shoulder. "I'll make sure this is followed up properly." As he exited the room again, every eye followed him. The moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about speaking up for himself. It was about confronting a system too often blind to its own bias. Outside, Kendrick sat in his car and pulled out his phone. He opened a blank email and began to write, detailing everything he had seen, heard, and felt in that courtroom. By the time he hit send, one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. By the following morning, Kendrick's phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. On the line was his supervisor, Julia Harper, a sharp, seasoned attorney known for her no-nonsense approach and decades of experience. "Kendrick, I read your report," she said, her voice carrying both urgency and curiosity. "If what you've outlined is accurate, this isn't an isolated incident. It points to a larger issue, potential systemic bias." "I believe that's exactly what it is," Kendrick replied. "What I witnessed wasn't subtle. It fits a pattern I've come across before, and I doubt I'm the only one who's gone through this." Julia let out a deep breath. "I'll get in touch with the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be addressed carefully but thoroughly. In the meantime, start compiling as much supporting material as possible. If this becomes public, we need to be fully prepared." The call ended, but Kendrick's real work was just beginning. He spent hours meticulously reconstructing every moment from the municipal court hearing. He sifted through public case records, highlighting discrepancies and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. Patterns emerged. Minor infractions carried harsher consequences for black defendants, while white defendants were more often let off with a warning or reduced fines. Kendrick began contacting fellow lawyers and community members, especially those who had stood before Judge Whitman. The floodgates opened. Stories came pouring in, some whispered confidentially, others shared with fearless honesty. A young black woman recounted being hit with a steep fine for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple citations walked away with a small fee. Another attorney described how Judge Whitman routinely interrupted black defendants, rarely letting them fully present their side. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission launched a formal investigation. Inspectors arrived at the courthouse requesting years' worth of records and speaking with court personnel. Mrs. Thompson, the longtime court clerk, became a central figure. Nervously, she handed over a small, worn notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are my notes," she admitted. "Every time something didn't feel right, I wrote it down. I've been scared to say anything, but I can't stay quiet anymore." Her journal revealed a damning pattern, dates, names, and examples of unequal treatment, all detailed with precision. James Wilson, the veteran courtroom bailiff, also stepped forward. He spoke with quiet confidence. "I've worked here for 15 years. I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to spread throughout the community. A young law student who had witnessed the courtroom exchange posted a detailed thread on social media. Within hours, it went viral, sparking outrage and prompting others to share similar stories. Local headlines followed quickly. "Bias in Greenville courtroom, federal prosecutor speaks out." National media picked up the story, and suddenly Kendrick found himself in the spotlight. Reporters called nonstop, but he chose to stay focused on the investigation. The mounting attention began to wear on Judge Whitman. Rumors circulated that he had been called into several closed-door meetings with oversight bodies. Publicly, he denied any misconduct, but behind closed doors, the pressure was undeniable. By the end of the first week, Julia called Kendrick again. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said. "The data is clear. Black defendants in Whitman's courtroom were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the same charges. This goes far beyond bias. It's institutional." "What's the next step?" Kendrick asked. "We're taking it to the state judicial board," Julia replied. "And Kendrick, this story isn't going away. Be ready." Though fatigued, Kendrick nodded silently. This had grown into something far more significant than he originally imagined, but he had no plans to step back. By the second week, the story had spread beyond Greenville. National networks covered the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Exposed," "Prosecutor Stands His Ground" dominated airwaves and news feeds. Social media exploded with hashtags like #EqualJusticeNow and #Bias in the Courts, with thousands sharing their own courtroom discrimination stories. Kendrick kept working closely with the Judicial Review Commission, helping consolidate the evidence. The numbers were damning. Over a 5-year period, Judge Whitman's rulings showed a consistent trend. Black defendants received fines averaging 300% higher than those levied on white defendants for identical infractions. Late arrivals by white individuals were often overlooked, while black defendants faced immediate penalties. Requests for leniency or payment plans were regularly denied for minorities but granted to others, and the statistics were only part of the story. Former defendants began speaking out. A black mother told how she was fined $500 over a zoning issue, even though she had documentation proving the city was at fault. A young black man described being scolded in open court and having his character questioned, only for the judge to casually dismiss a white man's case moments later. Local advocacy groups rallied. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding accountability. Justice should be blind. End courtroom bias. Though Kendrick kept his distance from the public outcry, he knew the moment was significant. More courthouse employees came forward. Mrs. Thompson's meticulous notes, when cross-referenced with official court records, revealed decades of discriminatory behavior. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she said during an interview. "But now, with all this coming to light, I can't be silent any longer." Even Bailiff Wilson made a public statement. "I've watched this happen for years. Enough is enough." Judge Whitman found himself increasingly alone. He initially dismissed the allegations as misunderstandings, but the growing pile of evidence made that impossible to sustain. In a rare public comment, he expressed regret for any unintentional harm he may have caused, but his words rang hollow. Kendrick, though overwhelmed by the national spotlight, remained steady. He kept prosecuting federal cases while helping the commission with its review. Messages poured in, emails, letters, phone calls from people across the country. Many offered support. Some shared their own courtroom horror stories. One letter stood out. A retired lawyer from Alabama wrote, "For years, I watched this kind of injustice but said nothing. Thank you for doing what so many of us never dared to." What started in one courtroom now stretched far beyond. Other judges across South Carolina found themselves under new scrutiny as activists and journalists began pulling court records. In response, the State Judicial Oversight Committee launched a full investigation of municipal courts statewide, vowing to uncover and confront systemic bias at every level. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission released its initial findings. The results were damning and the message was unmistakable. Judge Whitman's conduct was part of a much deeper systemic issue. The report recommended immediate changes, mandatory bias education for judges, frequent audits of judicial rulings, and the creation of independent oversight panels. The mounting pressure proved too great for Judge Whitman. Rather than face a public inquiry and possible disciplinary measures, he stepped down. In a short public address, he stated, "I believe stepping aside is in the best interest of this court and the community." Reactions were mixed. Some interpreted his resignation as a silent admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward progress. For Kendrick, the moment brought a sense of validation, but not triumph. Whitman's resignation wasn't the finish line. It was the starting point. Real change was still ahead. As reforms began rolling out, Kendrick stepped into a new position, an advocate and speaker. He was invited to share his experience at law schools, town halls, and legal symposiums, shedding light on the importance of confronting institutional prejudice. His story inspired a new generation of lawyers, especially those from marginalized communities, to view themselves as forces for reform. At one event, a young black law student approached Kendrick. "You helped me see that the law isn't just about rules," she said. "It's about people. You gave me a reason to keep fighting." Kendrick nodded, humbled. "The fight is far from over," he replied. "But if each of us does our part, we can build a better system." 3 months after the pivotal courtroom morning, Greenville's courthouse had a new look. The drab beige walls had been repainted, and a newly installed help desk welcomed visitors. Multilingual signage directed people to resources that had long been overlooked: legal aid, payment assistance, and procedural guides. Near the entrance, a plaque now read, "Equal justice is a right, not a privilege." Inside, the transformation ran deeper. With Whitman gone, a younger, fair-minded judge now presided over the bench. More critically, systematic reforms were being enacted. Every staff member now had to complete anti-bias training, guided by experts in racial equity and justice. Kendrick stood at the back of the courtroom, invited to address local judges and attorneys about the new changes. As he waited for his turn, a sense of cautious pride filled him. The road ahead was long, but the first steps had been taken. The ripple effect extended beyond Greenville. Other towns across South Carolina, and eventually the country, began reassessing their own courts. State judicial panels started mandatory case audits focused on racial and economic fairness. Oversight bodies made up of attorneys, advocates, and even past defendants were formed to track conduct and ensure accountability. Back at Kendrick's office, the momentum was tangible. The fine he received that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Beneath it was a photo of law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his name. Their bright smiles reminded him of his responsibility to the next wave of legal minds. The community, too, felt the change. James Wilson, the seasoned bailiff once under Whitman's command, now led training for new court officers. At one session, he told them, "Our duty isn't just to maintain order. It's to make sure every person is treated with respect. If something feels wrong, speak up. Silence makes you complicit." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, whose handwritten notes helped launch the investigation, was promoted to lead a new ethics and integrity program. She mentored junior staff and worked hard to ensure that the injustices of the past wouldn't be repeated. Kendrick also began teaching at a local law school, offering a seminar on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, often inspired by his journey, would linger after class, eager to discuss how they could make a difference. One day, a student approached him, notebook in hand. "What's the most important thing we can do to make the system better?" she asked. He paused before answering. "Listen, to the people in the courtroom, to those too afraid to speak up. Real change starts with listening. Of course, not everyone welcomed the reforms. Some judges and attorneys grumbled that the new oversight undermined their autonomy, but the statistics told a different story. Within a year, racial disparities in sentencing and fines dropped significantly in Greenville's court. More defendants were granted payment plans, and many said they felt treated with more fairness and respect. For Kendrick, the most meaningful moments were the personal ones. People would stop him and share their stories. One elderly black man who'd been in court that morning returned just to say, "Thank you." "I've been coming here for 40 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen too much injustice, but I never thought I'd see someone stand up. Thank you for giving us hope." One morning, Kendrick received a letter from a young public defender in Chicago. She had read about his case and launched her own inquiry into courtroom bias in her city. The letter ended with, "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer." Kendrick read it twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact. He leaned back, absorbing the weight of the moment. This had never been about him. It was about all the voices that had gone unheard for far too long, and the fact that they were finally being listened to. Months later, Kendrick returned to the courthouse, not for a case, but for a ceremony. He had been asked to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center, named in part because of his efforts. As he stepped up to the podium, he looked out at the crowd, judges, lawyers, staff, and community members, all waiting with a sense of anticipation. "Justice isn't just about laws," Kendrick began. "It's about how we treat people in our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about making sure that everyone, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The room erupted in applause. But Kendrick's gaze stayed on the people, their expressions full of hope, drive, and determination. The work wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but this was a meaningful beginning.